The condensation on the inside of the glass is always the first enemy. You have to understand, the attic window, my window, the primary vantage point from which I safeguard the moral integrity of this cul-de-sac, is single-paned. It is an architectural relic, much like myself, prone to the weeping influence of the temperature differential between the stale, heated air of my sanctuary and the biting, judgmental cold of the November night outside. I had to wipe it again. A slow, circular motion with the microfiber cloth I keep specifically for this purpose. Not a paper towel. Never a paper towel. The lint would catch on the imperfections of the glass, creating microscopic constellations of debris that, when viewed through high-powered optics, could easily be mistaken for movement, for evidence, for the shifting of a shadow where a shadow ought not to be. I checked my watch. The glowing indigo numerals of the digital face read 2:14 a.m. The neighborhood of Oak Creek was dead.
It was a silence that felt heavy, like a woolen blanket soaked in water, pressing down on the rooftops, smothering the chimneys. Most people think silence is empty, but I know better. Silence is full. It is full of the things people think they have hidden. It is full of held breaths and quiet footsteps, and the turning of tumblers in locks that have been greased to prevent the telltale click. My focus, as it had been for the last 17 nights, was on the Colonial at 42 Maplewood Drive, the Richardsons. To the untrained eye, the casual observer, the dog walker, the mail carrier, the Richardsons were the epitome of suburban banality. Ted was an accountant, or perhaps an actuary. He possessed that specific slumped posture of a man who spends his days moving numbers from one column to another, terrified of the decimal points. He drove a silver sedan that was washed every second Saturday. And then there was Elena Richardson.
A woman who, until 3 weeks ago, had been a fixture of the local gardening club. A woman whose most scandalous activity was perhaps pruning her hydrangeas a week too late in the season. But I saw the change. I always see the change. It started with the lights. Not the main lights, mind you. The main lights in the Richardson household followed a predictable circadian rhythm that I had logged in my leather-bound journal, volume 44, for years. Kitchen lights off at 10:15 p.m., master bedroom reading lamps on at 10:20 p.m., darkness by 11 p.m. But 3 weeks ago, a new variable entered the equation, a faint, almost imperceptible glow from the garage side door, a hesitation. I adjusted the focus wheel on my binoculars. These are not your garden variety bird-watching binoculars. These are military grade, purchased from a surplus auction 3 states over, heavy in the hand, smelling faintly of rubber and Cold War paranoia. The image sharpened. The grainy darkness of the street resolved into a crisp monochromatic green through the lenses. The front door of number 42 did not open.
It remained shut, the brass knocker standing guard like a mute sentry. No, the movement was at the side gate. The timber of the gate was warped. I knew this because 6 months ago, during the block party, I had walked past it and noted the misalignment of the latch. It should squeak. It must squeak. I held my breath, straining my ears against the ambient hum of the distant highway. Scritch. A sound so faint it might have been a dry leaf skittering across the pavement. But it wasn't a leaf. It was the gate. Elena Richardson slipped out. I pressed the eye cups of the binocular so hard against my orbits that I could feel the pulse in my temples. She was dressed, strangely. Not in the silk pajamas one might expect from a woman sneaking down to the kitchen for a glass of water, and not in the crisp running gear of a midnight jogger, though I have logged my fair share of those lunatics over the years. No, she was wearing a heavy, oversized canvas coat that swallowed her frame. It looked like something Ted would wear to clean the gutters.
On her head was a beanie, pulled low, obscuring that distinctive blonde bob of hers. She paused. She looked left, toward the dead end of the cul-de-sac, then right, toward the exit of the neighborhood. She was scanning for witnesses. She was scanning for me, though she didn't know it. She looked directly up at my house, at the dark peak of my roof. I didn't flinch. I didn't breathe. I was part of the darkness. I was the house. She began to walk. Now here is where the theory of the affair, the lover hypothesis, as I had titled it in my notes, began to gain significant traction, yet also encountered distinct anomalies. If she were meeting a lover, why the attire? Why dress like a longshoreman? Perhaps the lover was rough. Perhaps they met in the woods. The thought made my skin prickle. Not with excitement, you understand, but with the thrill of the hunt, the puzzle. I watched her move down the driveway. She didn't take the car. That was crucial. Taking the car wakes the house. The rumble of the garage door is a seismic event in a sleeping home. No, she was on foot.
She was carrying something. A bag. A duffel bag, dark in color, slung over her shoulder. It looked heavy. It swung with a pendulum's rhythm, hitting her hip with a dull, thudding cadence that suggested density. What was in the bag, Elena? A change of clothes? Lingerie to replace the canvas coat? Or something else? Evidence? She reached the edge of the property line and turned onto the sidewalk. Her pace was brisk, purposeful. This was not a stroll. This was a commute. I tracked her until she vanished behind the overgrown hedges of the Miller residence 3 doors down. I lowered the binoculars. My eyes burned. I reached for my thermos, stainless steel, filled with a dark roast that tasted of burnt hickory and vigilance, and took a small sip. The liquid was lukewarm.
I turned to my notebook. I uncapped my pen. November 14th, 2:18 a.m. Subject E.R. departs residence via side gate. Attire, heavy coat, concealment headgear. Luggage, heavy duffel. Direction, southbound. Anomaly. Subject appeared to check the soles of her boots before stepping onto the pavement. Why check the boots? Mud? Dirt? Was she going somewhere unpaved? I couldn't just sit there. The narrative was incomplete. The data was fragmented. I needed more. I needed to know what Ted knew. The next morning, the sun rose with a deceptive cheerfulness. It bathed Maplewood Drive in a golden light that tried to scrub away the secrets of the night. I was at my post, the front porch this time, disguised as a man enjoying his retirement, rocking slowly in a wicker chair, a newspaper I had already read twice spread across my lap. At 7:45 a.m., the front door of number 42 opened. Ted emerged. He looked terrible. I have studied human faces for decades. I know the topography of a good night's sleep, and I know the ravaged landscape of insomnia. Ted's face was a ruin.
The skin beneath his eyes was bruised with purple exhaustion. His tie was knotted slightly askew, a detail that screamed internal chaos for a man of his precision. He paused on the porch, blinking in the sunlight as if it physically hurt him. He turned back toward the door. Elena was there. I couldn't hear the words. The distance was 40 yards, and a squirrel was chattering incessantly in the oak tree above me. A nuisance, I would but I didn't need to hear the words. I speak the language of body mechanics. Ted gestured with his hands, palms up, pleading. Why? What is happening? Elena stood in the doorway, half in shadow. She wasn't wearing the canvas coat now. She was in a bathrobe, clutching a coffee mug with both hands, using it like a shield. She shook her head. Once, twice, a denial, or a refusal to explain. Ted's shoulders dropped. It was the universal gesture of a man defeated. He turned, walked to his silver sedan, and got in. He sat there for a full minute before starting the engine. I waited until he backed out of the driveway.
As he passed my house, I offered a small, neighborly wave. He didn't see me. He was staring 1,000 yards ahead, into a future where his marriage had dissolved into lies and midnight excursions. So, the husband suspects, the lover hypothesis was strong. But the bag, the heavy bag. The next 3 nights followed the same pattern: 2 a.m., 2:30 a.m., 1:45 a.m. Elena would leave. She would return roughly 2 hours later, just before the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. When she returned, she looked different. On the 4th night, I managed to get a better look at her return through the high magnification setting. She was coming back up the driveway. She stopped under the motion sensor light of her garage, which she had evidently disabled or taped over, as it failed to trigger, but the street lamp offered enough illumination. She was dirty. There were streaks on her face, smudges, dark, sooty marks on that canvas coat. And her hands. She wasn't wearing gloves. Her hands looked stained, not with lipstick, not with the perfumes of an illicit embrace,
but with something dark. Earth? Grease? She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving another streak. She looked exhausted, yes, but also exhilarated. There was a manic energy in the way she moved, a twitchiness. Who meets a lover to roll around in the mud? Unless... No, that was too speculative even for me. Was she digging something? Burying something? A chill, entirely separate from the draft in my attic, walked down my spine. The heavy bag, the dirt, the late hours, the secrecy. Was Elena Richardson disposing of something or someone? No. Ted was still alive. I saw him every morning, looking more and more like a ghost, but physically present. Maybe she was digging a grave in preparation, a preemptive strike. I needed to escalate. Passive observation had reached its yield limit. It was time for active reconnaissance. The following Tuesday, the conditions were perfect. Overcast sky. No moon.
A light drizzle that would dampen sound and mask footsteps. I prepared my gear. Dark clothing, matte black wool, silent against brush, soft-soled tactical boots, a small flashlight with a red lens filter to preserve night vision, and of course, the camera with the telephoto lens. I waited. 2:15 a.m. The side gate opened. Elena emerged. She had the bag. She had the coat. She had the beanie. I gave her a 30-second head start. I slipped out of my back door, moving through my own garden like vapor. I vaulted the low fence that separated my property from the drainage ditch that ran behind our street, a tactical route I had mapped out years ago for just such an occasion. I moved parallel to the street, keeping the hedgerows between us. I could hear her footsteps on the sidewalk. Clip-clop, clip-clop. She was moving fast. She reached the end of the cul-de-sac and turned left onto the main avenue that led out of the subdivision. I scrambled up the embankment, crouching behind a utility box. She wasn't walking to the woods. She wasn't walking to a waiting car.
She was walking toward the old commercial district. This part of town was a graveyard of commerce, a strip mall that had died in the early 2000s, a shuttered Blockbuster, a dry cleaner that had been seized by the IRS, and behind it, a row of self-storage units. You Store It, an ironic name, considering most people stored things there specifically to forget them. She approached the keypad of the main gate. I zoomed in with my camera, but the angle was bad. I couldn't see the code. She punched it in, 4 digits, and the gate rattled open with a mechanical groan that sounded deafening in the silence. She slipped inside. The gate began to close. I had to move. I sprinted across the asphalt, risking exposure. I threw myself into the gap just as the gate was sliding shut. I sucked in my gut, feeling the cold metal brush against the buttons of my jacket. I was in. Rows of identical orange doors stretched out under the flickering buzz of sodium Faber lights. It was a labyrinth of corrugated steel. I heard footsteps echoing down the third corridor to my right. I pressed myself against the cold metal of Unit 104. I waited. I listened. The sound of a rolling door going up, the screech of metal on metal, then the slam of it coming down. Silence again. I crept forward. I counted the units. 1, 2, 3. Light was spilling out from under the door of Unit 312, just a thin ribbon of yellow light cutting across the dirty concrete.
I approached Unit 312. I could hear sounds from inside. It wasn't the sound of passion. It wasn't the sound of two people whispering. It was a grinding sound, a whirring, like a dentist drill, but deeper. Zzz, zzz, followed by a sharp tap, tap, tap. Then a voice, Elena's voice. No, that's not right. Too symmetrical. It needs to look ravaged. Ravaged. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. What was she doing in there? I pictured a body on a table. I pictured her dismantling Ted's mistress. I pictured a meth lab. I needed to see. I got down on my knees. The concrete was wet and smelled of motor oil. I pressed my cheek to the ground, trying to peer through the half-inch gap between the bottom of the door and the pavement. The angle was difficult. I saw feet, her boots, and drop cloths. Plastic sheeting covering the floor. That wasn't good. Plastic sheeting is never good. It implies splatter. I saw debris falling, dust, white dust, and chips of something gray. She moved away from the door. I shifted my position.
Suddenly, the whirring stopped. "Damn it," she hissed. A crash, something heavy hitting a table. I froze. Had she heard me? "Why won't you bond?" she yelled at the object. "You're supposed to be necrotic tissue." Necrotic tissue. The air left my lungs. My worst fears were being realized. She was experimenting. She was building something, or preserving something. I had to know. I couldn't leave. This was the climax of the investigation. If I left now, I would never know if I was living across the street from a serial killer or a bioterrorist. I stood up. I looked for a way in. There was none. The door was locked from the inside. But then I noticed the unit next to it, 313, had a padlock that looked flimsy. I am not a criminal, you understand. I am an investigator. But in the pursuit of truth, certain boundaries become porous. I happen to carry a shim tool. It's for emergencies. This was an emergency. I popped the lock on 313. It took 6 seconds. I slid the door up just enough to crawl under, maybe 2 feet. I was inside the adjacent unit.
It was full of old mattresses and the smell of mildew. The walls between these units are not floor-to-ceiling concrete. They are corrugated steel partitions that often stop a few feet short of the roof to allow for airflow. I looked up. Wire mesh. I climbed the stack of mattresses. It was unstable, wobbling like a gelatinous tower, but I found my footing. I reached the top. I peered through the wire mesh into Unit 312. The view was perfect, and what I saw made my brain stutter. It wasn't a dungeon. It wasn't a love nest. It wasn't a drug lab. It was a wasteland. The entire 10 by 20 unit was filled with tables, and on those tables sat a sprawling miniature world, but not a cute model train town with happy villagers and red cabooses. It was a nightmare landscape. Elena was standing in the middle of it, wearing a jeweler's loop over one eye, wielding a Dremel tool like a scalpel. The sculptures were incredibly intricate, hyper-realistic dioramas, but the subject matter was grotesque.
I saw a miniature cathedral, perhaps 2 feet high, but it was bombed out, the stained glass shattered, and crawling over it, climbing the spires, were hundreds of tiny things. I squinted. They looked like zombies or mutants. She moved to another table. This one held a swamp. The water looked real. She must have used resin. Rising from the swamp were twisted trees, their roots gnarled and seemingly rotting. Hanging from the branches were tiny cages. She picked up a pair of tweezers and dipped them into a jar. She pulled out a tiny tuft of— was that moss? Real moss? Texture, she whispered to herself. It needs more grit. She applied the moss to the base of a ruined guard tower. She stepped back, critical, wiping her dusty hands on her canvas coat. I looked closer at the materials on her workbench. This explained everything. The heavy bag, bags of plaster, resin, clay, and sand. The late nights, resin curing times, and the undisturbed focus required for painting eyes on a figure the size of a grain of rice. The dirt, she was literally foraging.
I saw a pile of twigs, dried leaves, and rocks on a side table. She had been collecting scale-accurate debris from the neighborhood. That's why she was checking her boots. She was bringing nature inside. The weird smells? Solvents, paints, glues. She wasn't cheating on Ted with a man. She was cheating on him with a 1/64 scale post-apocalyptic dystopia. I watched her for 10 minutes. The level of obsession was terrifying. She painted a tiny rust streak on a miniature oil drum with a brush that had a single bristle. She didn't blink. Her breathing was shallow. This was a trance. This was a madness, but a creative one.
Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the workbench. It was loud in the echo chamber of the unit. She jumped, nearly dropping a bottle of paint. She snatched the phone. Ted? I strained to hear. I couldn't hear him, but I heard her. I know it's late. I couldn't sleep. A lie. No, I'm not. I'm just driving around, clearing my head. Another lie. Ted, stop. Please don't say that. There's no one else. She paused. She looked at the miniature wasteland, at the armies of tiny painted monsters she had created. It's just, I need space, Ted. I'm coming home. I'm coming home now. She hung up. She looked at the diorama one last time. She reached out and touched the spire of the ruined cathedral, a look of profound longing on her face. Then, she began to pack up. I had to get out. I scrambled down the mattresses, slipped under the door of Unit 313, relocked the padlock. A professional leaves no trace, and sprinted out of the complex before she could open her main door.
I made it back to Maplewood Drive just as her car— she must have walked to the car parked a few blocks away, I realized— turned the corner. I was back in my attic window, sweating, chest heaving, by the time she pulled into her driveway. I watched Ted open the front door. He stood there in his pajamas. Elena walked up the path, her heavy bag over her shoulder. He didn't yell. He just looked at her, and then at the back. He thinks it's a go bag. He thinks she's packing to leave him. He thinks the bag is full of her clothes, ready for the day she finally admits she doesn't love him anymore. He doesn't know the bag is full of high-density foam insulation and tiny hand-painted skulls. I watched them go inside. The door closed. The light went out. I sat there in the dark, my heart rate slowly returning to normal. I looked at my notebook. November 21st, 3:45 a.m. Subject ER, hobby identified. Warhammer or similar tabletop wargaming terrain construction. Extreme level of detail. Grimdark aesthetic. Subject is not adulterous.
Subject is a closeted nerd of the highest order. I capped my pen. The tragedy of it, of course, is the silence. Ted is lying in bed right now, staring at the ceiling, wondering whose hands have been on his wife, wondering why she smells like chemicals and earth. He is breaking his own heart with a story that isn't true. And Elena? She is lying next to him, her fingers twitching, dreaming of how to perfectly simulate the look of dried blood on a 28mm scale barricade. She is hiding her passion because she thinks it's silly, or because it doesn't fit the image of the perfect suburban wife, or perhaps because she fears he wouldn't understand the beauty of the ruin she is building. I could tell him.
I could slip a note in his mailbox. Your wife isn't seeing another man. She's building a diorama of the Chernobyl exclusion zone in a storage unit. But that would be interfering. That would be crossing the line. My job is not to intervene. My job is to know. My job is to be the keeper of the street's memory. I took a sip of my cold coffee. It was bitter, silty.
I looked at the house again. I wondered if she needed any help with the dry brushing technique on that cathedral. The texture looked a little flat from where I was standing. I wiped the condensation from the glass one last time. The sun would be up in 2 hours. The neighborhood would wake up, put on its mask, and pretend to be normal. But I knew the truth. I knew that behind the manicured hedges and the white picket fences, there were monsters. Tiny, plastic, hand-painted monsters. And somehow, that was far more interesting than an affair.